Hey guys, David here with Fressler Tech giving you a brief tutorial on how to connect a containerized Angular web app to a containerized .NETCore Web API. When creating a web application, you want to put as little business logic as possible directly into the UI code so that you can reuse as much logic as possible across multiple UIs such as web, Android, and iPhone. This leaves your UI to simply render fetch data. In our case, we want to pull data from the web API that we created in lesson 1 and render it in our new web app as depicted here. We will run the web API in the Docker container at port 8080 like we did in lesson 1. In order to do this, we will need to make some changes to the Angular site to fetch the data. In Angular, apps are comprised of modules. Those modules are comprised of components. Those components are classes whose members fetch and manipulate data. Those component classes are bound to HTML templates, which are used to render visualizations of that data. Here, we will be updating the primary module of our scaffolded web app to resolve new dependencies that we need. We need these dependencies so that we can update the app's primary component to fetch the data that we need from our web API. And we will update the primary HTML template to render the fetched data. If you did not have time to follow the previous tutorials to completion, you can use the links in the description for the final example of a containerized Angular web app communicating with a containerized .NETCore Web API. Open the web application created in the previous tutorial in VS Code using the terminal command code and the path to the web app. In my case, this is code. Once the web application is open in VS Code, you will need to update the primary module's sole component HTML to display the message that we will retrieve from the web API. This component definition will be in a file named app.component.html. First, remove all of the template code and leave only the router outlet code. So let's go to app.component.html. And you can see here at the very bottom, we have the router outlet. So we're going to delete all of this template code. And then we're going to create next we're going to create a paragraph element inside of the router outlet code. And then we're going to add some placeholder code. We're going to have the static string message, and then we're going to display the message property of our app.component. The HTML inside of app.component.html that we just edited is bound to the Angular component defined in app.component.ts, and that changes to the properties in the TS file will be automatically reflected in the UI. This component provides all of the business logic and variable values for the HTML. Add a new property to the class named message and update the value of message to loading. If the web app is not currently running, run the updated web app using ngserve. So it looks like our web app is now up and running. As you can see, we have message loading. Now that we have a default value, we can force the app component to retrieve the data from our web API upon loading. When the data is retrieved, it will automatically update the message value in the page to the message retrieved from the web API. First, update app.module.ts to import the HTTP client module. Second, update the app component, app.component.ts, to import the HTTP client. Third, add the code to create a constructor method for the app component. Constructors are methods that are called to initialize a class when a new instance of the class is instantiated. Fourth, inside of the constructor signature, inject an HTTP client member. So now your component should look like this. Now we'll load the data from our web API in the constructor of the component class using our HTTP client. So we're going to create a new variable called web API URL, and then we're going to point that variable to the location of our hello world controller for our web API. Next, we're going to retrieve the data from our web API. So we're going to create a method here. We're going to add some logic here, where we're going to use the HTTP client member that we created here, that we injected. And then we're going to call a GET request to our web API URL, that hello world controller. We're going to expect a response type of text. And then once that data is retrieved, we're going to change the value of our message property to the value of that data. So let's take a look at the browser just to verify that nothing was broken. Oh, it looks like I missed one thing here. So we created our HTTP client module, but we actually need to do an import. Okay, so now we see message loading. So we haven't actually started retrieving the data from the web API because the web API isn't running currently. But once the web API is running at the expected location, we should be able to retrieve that data, no problem. So you're now ready to build and run your updated web app and web API. In a terminal, build and run your web API if it is not running already. So we're going to get a terminal here. We're going to change directories. So we've changed directories to our web API folder, and then we're going to use the docker build command, if you guys remember from the previous tutorials. And it's going to be docker build -t to specify the tag name that we want to use, the repository name, and then the tag that we want, so version 1. And then we're going to specify the location to the Docker file, which is going to be our current working directory. And then once we've built our image, we can go ahead and use docker run -it-rm -p. We're going to map port 8080. We're going to use our local machines port 8080. We're going to map that to port 5000. So that's going to be the exposed port inside of the Docker container. And then we're going to use the repository name web API and tag name version 1. Okay. Okay, so it looks like it was successful. Let's go ahead and try to find that location here. And then I think last time we set it to hello world. Port 8080. Okay, so we have our string text, we have our web app, and now we just need to connect the two. So in a separate terminal, we want to build and run our web app. So I'm going to cancel this session. And then we're going to use very similar commands. We're going to use docker build -t, and we're going to use the web app tag here, version 1. And then we're going to specify the location to the Docker file, which is our current directory. And this may take a while the first time that you build the image, because all the base layers need to be retrieved from the Angular container registry. All right, so now we can use docker run -it-rm -p. We're going to use port 8081 for our web app, and then we're going to map this to port 80, which is the exposed port of our container. And this is the default for using the Nginx ingress controller. And then we're going to use the tag web app and version 1. Okay, and then we can navigate to port 8081, and then we can, just port 8081 should be the home page, and now we see this message loading. So once we have the page up, we can actually right-click and go to Inspect, and then let's go to the Network tab and refresh the page so that we can see all of the network calls once the page is first loaded. So we see that the call to our Hello World API failed for some reason. So it seems like it's able to reach the API, but it seems we have a cross-origin resource sharing error. And essentially what that means is that the C# API by default is so secure that it doesn't allow calls from outside of localhost 8080. So the domain of this application doesn't match the one of the web API, and the web API is not having it. It's not going to allow anyone from outside of the domain to reach it. Okay, so we're going to stop both our web app and our web API servers and the separate terminals using Control-C. Okay, we need to update the web API configuration to allow incoming requests from all possible domains of the web app. Stop both your web app and the web API servers and separate terminals, okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to open our web API. And be sure to differentiate between your web API and your web app. And we're going to navigate to the startup.cs class here. So what we're going to do first is we're going to create a string property on the class. I need to go at the top here. Okay. And this is going to specify the name of our rule, our allow origins rule. Second, in the configure services method, we're going to add a new function to call services.addCores. This will allow API calls from the domains listed. And lastly, in the configure method, we're going to add a function to call, called to app.useCores. And so this is going to use a configuration that we just set up. So we're going to allow these origins here. So lastly, your startup.cs class should look like the one here. And then if you do find yourself running short on time, then you can take a look at the examples inside of the description. There should be a link to the example repository with all of these files already there. Okay. All right, so let's give it another shot here. Let's go ahead and close out of the web API for Visual Studio Code, and we're going to rebuild our Docker container image for our web API. We don't need to do that for our web app. And then we're going to use Docker run to host our web API again. And then we're going to use Docker run for our web app. Okay. Okay, so let's give it another shot here. And you can see that we retrieve this time our hello world text. Great job creating your first microservices application using an Angular web app communicating with a DotnetCore Web API. In the next video, we're going to see how to create our Kubernetes cluster in order to deploy our containers into the cloud. See you in the next one.